The glass door of Vance Enterprises clicked shut, locking out the roaring noise of the downtown Manhattan rain, but the silence inside felt far more dangerous. Maya adjusted her worn leather portfolio, her fingers cold and trembling slightly against the smooth brass buckle. At 26 years old, she had learned to measure her life in precise, controlled angles, a habit born from 3 years of studying structural architecture and 4 years of keeping her bedridden mother alive on a freelance designer's wage. Her mother, Elena, had spent the last 2 decades whispering that the world was built on unstable foundations, warning Maya never to trust men who wore polished silver cufflinks. Maya checked her cheap watch, her heartbeat drumming against her ribs as she looked up at the only other candidate sitting across the sleek reception lobby. Did everyone in this building look like they had something to hide? The young man sitting opposite her wore a bespoke navy suit that screamed old money, yet his hands were fidgeting with a silver signet ring with an almost manic intensity. Maya caught his profile against the tinted floor-to-ceiling window, the sharp jawline, the slight asymmetry in the left eyebrow, the pale gray eyes that seemed perpetually guarded. A strange, unnatural chill ran down her spine, the kind of phantom recognition that makes the hair on your arms stand up before you even understand why. He turned his head at the exact same moment, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that felt almost physical, as if he were staring into a mirror that reflected a version of himself he had never been allowed to see. Why did a complete stranger's face feel like a memory she had spent her entire childhood trying to recall? Before either of them could speak, the frosted glass door at the end of the executive hallway opened, and the assistant gestured for them both to step forward. Maya stood up, smoothing down her thrifted blazer, while the young man adjusted his tie, his posture shifting instantly from anxious to arrogant. They walked side by side toward the corner office, their shoes clicking in an accidental, perfect synchronization on the white marble floor. Maya risked a glance at his profile again, noticing a small crescent-shaped birthmark just below his left earlobe, the exact same shape and position as the birthmark she concealed under her own dark hair. Was it possible that the universe was playing a cruel trick on her on the most important morning of her life? Arthur Vance sat behind an expanse of polished mahogany, looking every bit the ruthless logistics tycoon the business journals claimed he was. At 48, he possessed a terrifying kind of charm, iron gray hair, eyes as cold and blue as glacier water, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He motioned for them to sit in the 2 leather armchairs positioned side by side in front of his desk. 2 finalists for 1 senior director position, Arthur said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that filled the room like heavy fog. Julian Sterling, backed by a prestigious Ivy League degree, and Maya Lin, a self-taught prodigy with a portfolio that frankly shouldn't exist without formal training. As he reached out to pull their resumes closer, his tailored cuff slid back 2 inches, exposing his left wrist. Why did both candidates freeze at the exact same millisecond, their eyes glued to the thick, jagged, L-shaped scar running down his pale flesh? Maya's breath caught in her throat, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the armrests of her chair. That scar, the jagged double line that looked like a lightning bolt cutting through old burn tissue, was etched into her mind through a single black and white photograph her mother kept locked inside a wooden box under her bed. Elena had shown her that photograph only once, on the night before her health collapsed entirely, swearing that the man with that wrist scar was the monster who had abandoned them in a burning house 26 years ago. Maya glanced sideways at Julian and felt her blood run cold. Julian's jaw had dropped, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and sudden, furious recognition. How could a stranger raised in wealthy socialite circles be staring at the exact same scar, with the exact same horror? Julian reached slowly into his inner jacket pocket, his hand trembling so hard he nearly dropped the small, faded silver locket he pulled out. Without asking for permission, he snapped it open on Arthur Vance's desk, revealing a tiny portrait of a young woman with dark hair and pale gray eyes, holding 2 infant twins wrapped in identical yellow blankets. "My father died when I was 2 weeks old in a factory fire," Julian whispered, his voice cracking beneath its polished facade. "My adoptive parents gave me this locket when I turned 18, and they told me the man who set that fire had a scar on his wrist that looked like a broken key." Arthur Vance slowly lowered his hands, his expression flattening into an unreadable mask as his cold blue eyes darted between Julian and Maya. If Arthur was the murderer who ruined both their families, why was he looking at them not with guilt, but with a terrifying, hungry satisfaction? Maya stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. "My mother told me my father burned to death in that same factory," she said, her voice shaking with a rage she had suppressed for 26 years. She told me he stayed behind to save his business partner, a man named Arthur Vance. Arthur didn't flinch. Instead, he rested his chin on his steepled fingers, his scar fully visible under the bright recessed lights of his office. Your mother lied to you, Maya, Arthur said calmly, leaning forward until his shadow stretched over both of them. And Julian's adoptive parents gave him half a story because they were paid very well to keep the other half buried. What kind of monster invites the children of his past victims into his office just to tear their reality apart? Julian stood up beside Maya, the unspoken tension between them instantly dissolving into a unified front against the man behind the desk. You've stolen my family's legacy, Julian spat out, stepping closer to the desk with his fists clenched. My adoptive father was your chief financial officer before he suddenly retired to Europe. He left me a trust fund funded by offshore accounts traced directly to Vance Logistics. Arthur gave a low, dry chuckle that held no warmth at all. You think money is the secret here, Julian? Arthur asked softly, opening his top desk drawer and pulling out a thick yellowed envelope sealed with red wax. The fire 26 years ago wasn't an accident, nor was it a corporate takeover. It was a staged execution. Before Maya could process the word, her phone in her coat pocket began to vibrate incessantly with an emergency alert from her mother's home nurse. Why was her mother's medical monitor going off at the exact moment the truth was finally coming to light? Maya pulled out her phone with a trembling hand, her eyes widening as a text message from the nurse popped up. Your mother just woke up crying out your name. She says if you are at Vance Enterprises, you need to run right now. Maya looked up at Arthur, her pulse hammering in her ears as the air in the room grew heavy and suffocating. She knows I'm here, Maya whispered, backing away toward the heavy office door. Arthur didn't try to stop her. He simply gestured toward the yellowed envelope on his desk. Your mother knows you're here because she's been waiting 26 years for you to find out who she really is, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. If you walk out that door right now, Maya, you'll spend the rest of your life caring for a woman who didn't save you from the fire. She took you from it. Was her entire life of devotion to her sick mother built on a kidnapping? Julian grabbed the envelope off the desk, his eyes darting between Maya and the sealed paper. Don't listen to him, Julian said, though his own voice sounded hollow, stripped of all his previous confidence. He's trying to manipulate us, Maya. Look at him. He's a sociopath who brought us both here to play some sick psychological game. Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, a cold, mocking smile playing on his thin lips. I didn't bring you here, Julian, Arthur said, pointing a single finger at the young man's suit jacket. Check your incoming mail from last Tuesday. You didn't apply for this job. An anonymous recruiter headhunted you and paid your flight from Boston. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his face draining of all color as he scrolled through his emails. Who had been orchestrating their meeting from the shadows, if not the man sitting right in front of them? The room seemed to tilt around Maya as the pieces of her reality began to fracture and collide. Who recruited us? Maya demanded, stepping back toward the desk and slamming her hand onto the mahogany surface. Arthur simply reached out and tapped a small button on his desktop intercom. Bring in Mrs. Lynn's medical records from the 1998 county archive, Arthur spoke into the speaker, his eyes fixed on Maya's face. Within seconds, his private secretary walked in, holding a dusty brown file folder, placing it gently next to the sealed wax envelope. Arthur opened the folder, revealing a faded hospital record with a photograph of a younger Elena attached to the upper corner. Why did the official police documents stamped across the top of the file classify her mother not as a victim, but as a wanted fugitive charged with grand larceny and child abduction? Maya felt her throat tighten so hard she could barely breathe. This is fake, she stammered, pulling the paper closer, her eyes scanning the faded black typewriter ink. My mother is an artist. She raised me alone in a 2-room apartment. She sacrificed everything for me. Arthur leaned forward, his gray eyes piercing right through her. She sacrificed your life to keep herself out of prison, Arthur said flatly. 26 years ago, Victor Sterling, your real father, owned the largest shipping firm on the East Coast, and I was his lead accountant, while your mother was his executive assistant. He paused, tracing the L-shaped scar on his wrist with a slow, deliberate thumb. When Victor discovered that Elena had embezzled $4 million from the company accounts, she didn't surrender. She set fire to the archives to burn the paper trail. If Elena was the arsonist, how did Arthur get the scar that matched her father's description? Julian grabbed the police report from Maya's hands, his eyes racing down the lines of text. This says Victor Sterling died in the fire trying to save his infant twins, Julian said, his voice rising in panic. If Victor died, then who are you, Arthur? Why do you have his scar? Arthur pulled back his sleeve further, revealing that the scar wasn't just on his wrist, it extended all the way up his forearm in a twisted line of graft tissue. Because I was the man who ran back into the burning building to drag Victor out, Arthur whispered, his voice finally cracking with a sliver of genuine, painful emotion. I saved Victor, but I couldn't save his wife. And when we came out, one of the two babies left in the carriage outside was gone, along with Elena. If Arthur was the hero who tried to save her family, why had he spent 26 years letting Maya's mother live in peace while Julian was given away to strangers? Maya shook her head violently, refusal screaming in every fiber of her being. No, that's impossible. My mother has been paralyzed from the waist down since I was 6 years old from an industrial accident. Arthur looked at her with a mixture of pity and brutal detachment. There was no industrial accident, Maya, Arthur said quietly. Check her medical file. The spinal damage was caused by a bullet wound sustained during a police shootout 3 days after the fire, when she tried to cross the border into Canada with you in her arms. Maya's mind reeled back to her childhood, the way her mother always refused to let doctors into the house, the way she insisted on taking private medication brought by a mysterious man who visited once a month. Was the man who delivered that medication sitting right in front of her, or was there another player in this nightmare who hadn't shown his face yet? Julian dropped the paper, his hands trembling as he stared at Maya. If you are Victor Sterling's daughter, then you're my twin sister, he whispered, the reality of the words settling over them like heavy iron. For a fraction of a second, a wave of profound, overwhelming warmth washed over Maya, the realization that she wasn't alone in the world, that she had a brother who shared her eyes and her blood. But that warmth was instantly extinguished when Arthur reached out and broke the red wax seal on the yellowed envelope. You are twins, yes, Arthur said, pulling out a thick set of legal documents printed on heavy parchment, which means under Victor Sterling's final, unamended will, the remaining 51% controlling stake in Vance Enterprises belongs exclusively to the surviving legitimate heir of the Sterling estate. Why was Arthur offering a fortune worth hundreds of millions of dollars to two strangers he had just met? Victor didn't die 26 years ago in that fire, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent a cold shudder straight down Maya's spine. Julian gasped, stepping back until his spine hit the glass wall of the office. What are you talking about? Julian demanded, his voice cracking. You just said you dragged him out. Arthur slowly stood up from behind his desk, walking toward the grand floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the rainy city street below. I dragged his body out of the flames, but he was brain-dead from smoke inhalation, Arthur said softly, his reflection staring back at them from the dark glass. He lived in a private care facility in upstate New York, on life support for 25 years, until he passed away 3 days ago. If their father had only died 3 days ago, why did the job interview for this exact position get posted 3 weeks ago? Maya felt the floor slipping out from beneath her feet as the timeline shattered in her mind. 3 weeks ago? She asked out loud, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain against the window pane. The job listing was posted a month ago. How could you know Victor was going to die? Arthur turned around slowly, his face shrouded in shadow against the gray light of the window. I didn't post the job listing, Maya, Arthur said, his eyes locking onto hers with a chilling certainty. The job listing was created and paid for by the primary trustee of the Sterling estate, the person who held power of attorney over Victor's medical decisions and pulled the plug 3 days ago. Who held power of attorney over a billionaire in a coma if both his children were missing and his wife was dead. Julian's face went completely blank, his eyes sliding sideways toward the silver locket lying open on the mahogany desk. My adoptive father, Julian whispered, his hands dropping to his sides like dead weights. He wasn't just your CFO, he was the executor of the estate. Arthur nodded slowly, taking a step toward Julian. Your adoptive father, Marcus Sterling, spent 26 years bleeding the trust fund dry while keeping your father on life support so he could draw millions in management fees, Arthur said bitterly. And 3 weeks ago, when he realized the federal auditors were closing in on his offshore accounts, he decided it was time to put Victor to sleep and let the two long-lost twins destroy each other over the remaining scraps. But if Marcus planned this to destroy them, why did Arthur agree to host the interview in his own office? Maya felt a surge of cold adrenaline clear the fog from her mind as she looked from Arthur to Julian, and then down at the papers scattered across the desk. You're lying, Maya said firmly, her voice suddenly steadying as her architectural training snapped back into place. looking for the structural flaw in the narrative. If Marcus wanted us to fight over the inheritance, why did he send us both here to meet you? You're not a neutral party, Arthur. You built this entire company on Victor's original shipping routes. Arthur didn't blink, but a tiny twitch in his jaw betrayed him. Because Marcus has something on me, Arthur admitted quietly, lowering his head. Something that would put me in prison for the rest of my life. What could a disgraced CFO have on a billionaire logistics mogul that was worse than arson and kidnapping? Before Arthur could answer, the heavy double doors of the office burst open, and two armed men in dark raincoats stepped into the room, followed by an older man walking with a polished silver cane. Marcus Sterling stepped into the frame, his face lined with age and cold, calculated greed, his gray eyes identical to Julian's. "That's enough history lessons for one afternoon, Arthur," Marcus said, his voice smooth and devoid of any emotion. Julian stared at his adoptive father in utter betrayal, taking a step toward him. "Dad, what is this? What have you done?" Julian cried out, his voice raw with pain. Marcus didn't even look at Julian. His eyes were fixed entirely on the thick parchment document sitting on Arthur's desk. "I'm securing my investments, son," Marcus said coldly, waving his hand toward the guards. "Sign the transfer documents, Arthur, or the police will receive the original security footage from the night of the fire, the footage showing who actually started the blaze." Why was Marcus threatening Arthur with footage of the fire if Elena was the one accused in the police reports? Maya looked at the video thumb drive Marcus pulled from his coat pocket, her mind racing at breakneck speed. "The scar," Maya suddenly said out loud, her eyes snapping to Arthur's wrist. "The scar on your arm isn't from saving my father from the fire, is it?" Arthur closed his eyes, letting out a long, shuddering breath that sounded like a confession before he even spoke a word. "No," Arthur whispered, refusing to look at her. "The scar was from the metal safe inside Victor's office, the safe I was trying to crack while the room burned around us." Maya felt her heart freeze solid as the realization hit her like a physical blow. Arthur wasn't a hero who tried to save her father. He was Marcus's accomplice who looted the company while her father was dying in the flames. "Elena didn't set the fire," Maya declared, her voice echoing in the silent office as she stepped between Marcus's armed guards and the desk. Marcus laughed, a short, ugly sound that rattled in his throat. "Your mother was a thief, girl," Marcus said, taking a step forward with his cane. "She found out what Arthur and I were doing, and she tried to run away with the original ledgers to hand them over to the federal prosecutor. That's why she took you." Maya grabbed the brown archival file from the desk and flipped directly to the police report detailing her mother's arrest. If she was running away with the money, why does this report say she was found with zero cash, carrying only a single steel lockbox containing my birth certificate and a copy of Victor's original will? Maya demanded, slamming the file onto the desk. Why had everyone spent 26 years calling her mother a criminal when all she had ever done was protect the evidence that could tear this empire down? Julian stared at Marcus, his body shaking with a profound, bitter realization. "You didn't adopt me out of love," Julian said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "You kept me close so that if Elena ever came out of hiding with the truth, you could use me as leverage against her." Marcus's cold expression didn't soften for a single second. "You lived a life of absolute luxury, Julian. You had the best schools, the best clothes, the best opportunities," Marcus spat out, glaring at his adoptive son. "You owe me everything you are, so don't preach morality to me when you're standing in a room built on stolen millions." Julian looked down at his silver signet ring, the ring Marcus had given him on his 21st birthday, and slowly pulled it off his finger, dropping it onto the floor where it rolled across the marble. What happens when a person realizes their entire identity was nothing more than an insurance policy for a monster? "It's over, Marcus," Arthur said suddenly, stepping away from the window and reaching for his desk phone. "I'm calling the district attorney myself. I'd rather spend 10 years in a federal prison for corporate fraud than let you walk out of here with Victor's legacy." Marcus's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits, and he gestured subtly to the guard standing closest to Arthur. The guard immediately drew a suppressed pistol from his shoulder holster and aimed it directly at Arthur's chest. "You won't be calling anyone, Arthur," Marcus said softly, his voice dripping with venom. "You're going to sign the asset transfer, and then these two tragic, long-lost twins are going to suffer a devastating car accident on their way back from this emotional reunion." Did Marcus really think he could murder two heirs in broad daylight inside a Manhattan skyscraper without anyone noticing? A sudden, sharp knock at the office door shattered the dead silence of the room. Before Marcus's guards could react, the heavy glass doors were pushed open, and four uniformed NYPD officers, flanked by two federal agents in dark suits, stepped into the executive suite with their weapons drawn. "Marcus Sterling, drop the cane and put your hands behind your head," the lead federal agent commanded, his voice booming through the room. Marcus froze, his face turning an ash-gray color as the guards slowly lowered their weapons and raised their hands in the air. How could the federal authorities have arrived at the exact floor of a private executive suite at the precise minute a crime was taking place? Behind the federal agents, a young woman pushed a wheelchair into the room, and sitting in that wheelchair, wrapped in a dark wool coat with her chin held high, was Elena Lynn. Maya gasped, taking 3 frantic steps toward her mother, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Mom? How are you here?" Maya stammered, her knees threatening to give way under her weight. Elena reached out her frail, paper-thin hand, catching Maya's fingers in a grip that was surprisingly firm, her pale gray eyes, the exact same eyes as Maya and Julian, shining with tears. "I called the Federal Bureau 3 hours ago, sweetie," Elena said, her voice raspy but steady. "I knew the moment you left the house this morning that today was the day Marcus's statute of limitations ran out on the asset trust. Had her bedridden, frail mother planned this entire intervention from a tiny bedroom across town?" Elena looked past Maya, her eyes settling on Julian for the first time in 26 years, tears silently spilling over her worn cheeks. "Julian, my boy," Elena whispered, her voice breaking with an unbearable weight of grief and longing. Julian stepped forward, falling to his knees beside her wheelchair, his arrogant posture completely shattered as he looked into the face of the mother he was told had died in a fire. You didn't abandon me?" Julian asked, his voice barely a breath. Elena reached out with her free hand, gently touching the crescent-shaped birthmark below Julian's left earlobe. "Marcus took you from the hospital room while I was in surgery after the shootout," Elena wept, her fingers trembling against his skin. "He told the police I was a kidnapper so no one would listen to me when I tried to claim you back. How much pain can a single mother endure while waiting 26 years just to hold both her children in the same room again?" The federal agents slapped heavy steel handcuffs onto Marcus's wrists, leading him out of the office alongside his silent guards, while another agent began securing the documents and the video thumb drive on Arthur's desk. Arthur didn't try to run or argue. He simply held out his hands, letting the officers cuff his wrists right over the L-shaped scar that had bound his destiny to the Sterling family for a quarter of a century. As Arthur was led toward the door, he paused beside Elena's wheelchair, looking down at her with a heavy, hollow expression. "I'm sorry, Elena," Arthur said softly, his voice devoid of any of his previous corporate power. "I was a coward." Elena didn't look up at him. She simply tightened her grip on Maya and Julian's hands, letting the past burn away in the silence of the room. What is the value of an apology when it comes 26 years too late to save a broken family? 2 months later, the morning sun broke through the clouds over Central Park, casting a warm golden light through the high windows of the newly restructured Sterling Lynn Foundation headquarters. Maya sat at a large drafting table, sketching out the architectural plans for a new community center funded by the recovered assets of her father's estate. Julian walked into the room carrying 2 paper cups of coffee, setting one down beside her blueprints, with a small, genuine smile that had completely replaced his former arrogant smirk. "The board just approved the construction budget for the upstate facility," Julian said, taking a seat across from her. "And the legal team finalized the transfer. Everything our father left behind is officially secured in a transparent trust for victims of corporate fraud." They had spent 60 days rebuilding their lives from the ground up, learning how to be siblings after a lifetime of living as strangers. But as Maya looked down at the blueprints on her desk, a quiet, nagging detail from that fateful afternoon in Arthur's office suddenly re-entered her mind. She pulled out her phone and opened a digital copy of the original police report from the night of the fire 26 years ago, the document her mother had kept hidden in her steel lockbox for decades. Maya zoomed in on the bottom corner of the 3rd page, where a handwritten nurse's log detailed the exact time the twin infants were admitted to the emergency ward following the blaze. According to the official hospital timestamp, baby A, Julian, was checked in at 11:42 p.m., while baby B, Maya, was checked in at 11:44 p.m. But when Maya opened the sealed birth certificate her mother had given her last week, the official time of birth listed for Maya was 11:40 p.m., making her 2 minutes older than her brother. Why would a hospital log show that the younger twin arrived at the emergency room 2 minutes before the older twin was even brought in from the fire? Maya slowly raised her eyes from her phone screen, looking across the table at Julian, who was casually sipping his coffee while scrolling through his emails. She remembered the crescent-shaped birthmark below his left ear, and then she remembered the old black-and-white photograph her mother had shown her as a child, where the baby wrapped in the yellow blanket on the left was the one with the birthmark. If the baby on the left was born first, then Julian wasn't the younger twin who was stolen by Marcus from the hospital. Julian was the baby Elena had carried out of the house herself. The realization hit Maya like a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure, causing the breath to catch in her lungs. If Elena had escaped with Julian that night, then the baby left behind in the carriage, the baby Marcus picked up and raised as his own, was actually Maya, whom Elena had swapped at the hospital 3 days later to protect her from Marcus's legal threats. Elena hadn't just saved one child and lost the other to a villain. She had intentionally given up her firstborn daughter to a corrupt billionaire to buy time to keep her son alive, only to spend 26 years orchestrating a slow, methodical revenge plot, using Maya as the ultimate Trojan horse to dismantle Marcus's empire from within. Maya looked out the window at the bustling city streets below, feeling a cold, profound chill wash over her skin as every memory of her childhood, every sacrifice, every lesson, every quiet word from her mother, realigned into a terrifyingly brilliant master plan. She was never just a devoted daughter caring for a sick mother. She was the designed weapon built to shatter a legacy,